Vorth pulled his thin arms closer to his chest as another wave of cold air swept through the maintenance tunnel. The metal floor felt like ice against his brittle shell, but he had nowhere else to go. Once, his shell had glowed with beautiful, blue and silver patterns that danced like lightning across his back. Other Keltorians would stop and admire the intricate designs that marked him as a respected elder of his people. Now those same patterns had faded to a lifeless grey. The younger Keltorians couldn't even see him anymore. In their culture, when the shell patterns died, so did the person wearing them. He might as well have been invisible. The maintenance tunnels of Nexus Station buzzed with activity above his head. Thousands of beings from dozens of different worlds walked, crawled, and floated through the corridors every day. Traders hawked exotic goods from distant planets. Diplomats rushed to important meetings. Families explored the shopping districts, filled with wonders from across the galaxy. But down here in the forgotten spaces beneath the station, Vorth sat alone. His stomach cramped with hunger that had become his constant companion for the past 7 days. The pain was getting worse. Soon, he knew, it would stop hurting altogether. That's when Keltorians like him usually just closed their eyes and never opened them again. He heard footsteps echoing through the tunnel, heavy boots, not the light padding of alien feet. Probably another maintenance worker coming to check the power lines. Vorth pressed himself deeper into the shadows between two large pipes, hoping to avoid another confrontation. The last worker had threatened to call security if he found Vorth here again. The footsteps stopped right in front of his hiding spot. Vorth held his breath, trying to make himself even smaller. Maybe if he stayed perfectly still, the person would move on. "Hey there," a gentle voice said in accented galactic standard. "Are you okay?" Vorth looked up in surprise. A young human male stood there, wearing the blue jumpsuit of a supply runner. His dark hair was messy from work, and his kind eyes showed genuine concern. Most beings looked at Vorth with disgust or fear when they noticed him at all. But this human seemed different. The human crouched down to Vorth's level, moving slowly so as not to frighten him. Jin, according to the name patch on his uniform, was probably in his 20s by human standards. He carried a data pad and a small toolkit, standard equipment for someone making delivery runs throughout the massive station. "You don't look so good," Jin said softly. "When's the last time you ate something?" Vorth tried to answer, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. His throat was too dry and he was too weak to speak properly. He gestured helplessly with one thin hand, unable to explain his situation. Jin frowned with worry. He pulled out his datapad and activated the universal translator. The device hummed to life, ready to convert speech between different alien languages. "Try speaking your native language," Jin suggested. "This thing should pick it up." Vorth managed to croak out a few words in ancient Keltorian. The translator worked its magic, converting his desperate plea into words Jin could understand. 7 days without food, the device announced in its mechanical voice. Cannot find sustenance. Shell patterns faded, abandoned by people. Jin's expression darkened as he understood the situation. Around them, the station continued its busy routine, completely unaware of the quiet tragedy unfolding in the forgotten tunnels below. Jin sat down on the cold metal floor next to Vorth, ignoring the dirt and grease that would stain his uniform. He held up his datapad, speaking slowly and clearly so the translator could pick up every word. "What do your people usually eat?" Jin asked. "Maybe I can help you find some food." Vorth's faded eyes filled with something that might have been hope. Through the translator, his weak voice explained the cruel reality of Keltorian biology. His people needed a rare mineral compound called zilithium that existed naturally in the soil of their homeworld. Without it, their bodies slowly shut down, starting with the colorful shell patterns that defined their identity. "The compound exists in space," Vorth whispered through the translator, "but refined zilithium costs 800 credits per dose. I need 1 dose every 3 days to survive." Jin did quick math in his head. That was more than he earned in 2 months as a supply runner. For someone like Vorth, who couldn't work anymore, it might as well cost 1,000,000 credits. As Jin pondered this problem, he heard voices approaching from the main corridor. 2 Volthari traders were discussing business in their harsh, guttural language. Jin recognized them from the upper levels. They ran a successful import business and looked down on anyone they considered beneath them. "Human," one of the Volthari called out when he spotted Jin. "Why do you waste time with the grey shell? It is already dead, just hasn't stopped breathing yet." The second Volthari laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Typical human emotion. You cannot save everything, soft skin. Some things are meant to die." Jin felt his jaw clench with anger, but he kept his voice calm. "He's not dead. He just needs help." "Help?" The first Volthari's 4 eyes widened in mock surprise. "Do you know how much Zilithium costs? You could buy a small ship for what it would take to keep that relic alive for 1 year." Other aliens began gathering, drawn by the commotion. A group of Nexian bureaucrats whispered among themselves, their crystalline faces showing disapproval. A family of Thrakari warriors shook their heads as they passed, clearly thinking Jin was wasting his time. "The natural order exists for a reason," declared Kex, a high-ranking Nexian official who oversaw station maintenance. "When a being can no longer contribute to society, resources should not be wasted prolonging the inevitable. This is simple. Logic." Jin stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "Where I come from, we don't abandon people just because they get old or sick." The Volthari traders exchanged glances and burst into harsh laughter again. "Humans and their primitive emotions," one sneered. "No wonder your species took so long to achieve space travel. You waste energy on the weak instead of focusing on the strong." More aliens stopped to watch the confrontation. Jin could feel their judgment, their certainty that he was being foolish. Some seemed genuinely confused by his behavior, as if the concept of helping someone without expecting anything in return was completely foreign to them. 800 credits every 3 days, Jin muttered to himself, looking back down at Vorth. The old Keltorian had shrunk back into the shadows, clearly embarrassed by the attention and the cruel words being thrown around. "Even if you had the money," Kex added with cold logic, "which you clearly do not on a supply runner's salary, you would only delay the inevitable. His shell patterns will never return. His own people have already written him off as dead." The crowd began to disperse, most of the aliens shaking their heads at human foolishness. But Jin remained kneeling next to Vorth, his mind racing. There had to be another way. Humans hadn't conquered the challenges of Earth by accepting that some problems couldn't be solved. "Don't listen to them," Jin told Vorth quietly. "We'll figure something out." Jin couldn't stop thinking about Vorth as he continued his delivery route through the station's lower levels. Every shadow seemed to hide another tragedy. Every forgotten corner might conceal someone else in desperate need. He found himself taking longer routes, peering into maintenance shafts and abandoned storage areas he'd never bothered to explore before. That's when he started finding them. In a disused cargo bay behind the water recycling plant, Jin discovered an elderly Keltorian, female huddled next to a broken heating unit. Her shell was even more faded than Vorth's, nearly white with age and malnutrition. She barely lifted her head when Jin's flashlight found her. 2 levels down, in the maze of pipes that carried waste from the upper decks, he found 3 more. They had created a small shelter from discarded metal sheets, but it offered little protection from the cold. One of them was so weak he couldn't even speak to Jin's translator. The pattern continued throughout the forgotten spaces of Nexus Station. Behind the main power generators, tucked into ventilation shafts, hiding in the gaps between hull plates, Jin found dozens of elderly Keltorians, all slowly dying in the darkness. By the end of his shift, Jin had counted 47 of them. 47 beings who had once been valued members of society, now cast aside like broken equipment. His hands shook as he made notes on his datapad, documenting their locations and conditions. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to call. Hana worked in the station's medical bay, one of the few humans in the health services department. Jin had known her since they'd both arrived on Nexus Station 2 years ago. She was smart, compassionate, and never turned away from a problem, just because it seemed impossible to solve. Jin found her finishing her evening shift, updating patient records on her computer terminal. The medical bay was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitoring equipment from the overnight ward. "Hana, I need to ask you something," Jin said, sliding into the chair across from her desk. "What do you know about Keltorian biology?" She looked up from her screen, her tired eyes showing curiosity. "Not much beyond the basics. Why? Are you feeling okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jin told her everything. About Vorth in the maintenance tunnel, about the cruel laughter of the other aliens, about the dozens of dying Keltorians he'd found throughout the station. Hana listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "Zilithium deficiency," she said when Jin finished. "I've read about it in the medical journals, but I've never actually seen a case. The mineral compound maintains their cellular structure. Without it, their organs literally start breaking down." She pulled up a medical database on her computer, scrolling through pages of technical information about Keltorian physiology. The details were horrifying. Without regular zilithium supplements, elderly Keltorians experience kidney failure within 2 weeks, liver shutdown within a month, and complete cardiac arrest within 6 weeks. "Jin, if what you're telling me is true, we're not just talking about hunger," Hana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're talking about 47 people dying slow, painful deaths right under our feet." "I know," Jin replied, running his hands through his hair. "And nobody cares. The station authorities treat them like they're already dead. Their own people won't even acknowledge they exist." Hana leaned back in her chair, staring at the medical data on her screen. "The worst part is this isn't accidental neglect. This is systematic abandonment. Keltorian society deliberately cuts off support for their elderly the moment their shell patterns fade." "Can we help them?" Jin asked. "Is there any way to synthesize zilithium or find a substitute?" Hana was quiet for a long moment, reading through the technical specifications. "The compound is incredibly complex," she finally said. "But theoretically, yes, the problem is cost and equipment. We'd need access to a proper laboratory and raw materials that cost more than either of us makes in a year." Jin felt his heart sink, but then he saw something in Hana's expression that gave him hope. She wasn't looking at him with the same dismissive pity he'd seen from the aliens earlier. She was looking at him like someone ready to fight. Jin spent every free moment buried in research. His small quarters aboard the station became a makeshift laboratory, with data pads scattered across his desk and medical journals displayed on every available screen. He'd never been much of a student back on Earth, but desperation had a way of sharpening focus. The Keltorian biology texts were dense and filled with scientific terms that made his head spin. But Jin pushed through, taking notes and cross-referencing information late into the night. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford when 47 lives hung in the balance. "You look terrible," Day observed when Jin reported for his morning shift. His supervisor was a practical man who'd worked on Nexus Station for over a decade. He'd seen countless supply runners come and go, and he could spot trouble from a mile away. "I'm fine," Jin mumbled, checking his delivery schedule on his datapad. His eyes were bloodshot from staring at screens, and his hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little rest. Day wasn't convinced. "Word's getting around that you've been bothering the medical staff with questions about alien biology. That's not your job, Jin. Your job is moving cargo from point A to point B. I'm just curious about the different species on the station," Jin said, trying to sound casual. "Is that a problem?" "It is when it affects your work performance," Day replied sternly. "Yesterday you delivered medical supplies to the wrong sector because you weren't paying attention. The day before, you showed up 20 minutes late because you were researching something in the library." Jin felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Day was right. His obsession with finding a solution for the Keltorians was affecting his regular duties. But how could he explain that he couldn't focus on mundane tasks when people were dying in the tunnels below? "Look, kid," Day continued, his voice softening slightly. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but you need to get your priorities straight. There are thousands of species on this station, all with their own problems. You can't save everyone." Those words echoed what Jin had heard from the alien traders, but hearing them from another human stung even more. Was he really being foolish? Was his determination to help the Keltorians just naive idealism? That night, Jin sat in his quarters, staring at pages of chemical formulas and molecular structures. Zilithium was incredibly complex, composed of 17 different elements in precise ratios. The industrial synthesis required temperatures of over 3,000 degrees and pressure chambers that cost more than his annual salary. But as Jin studied the breakdown of Zilithium's components, something caught his attention. 3 of the core elements, manganese, titanium oxide, and selenium, were surprisingly common throughout the station. In fact, he'd been handling containers of these materials for months without realizing their significance. Jin pulled up the station's inventory database, cross-referencing chemical compounds with his newfound knowledge. His heart started racing as he discovered that industrial cleaning solvents contained high concentrations of manganese compounds. The hull maintenance crews used titanium oxide in their welding processes. Even the water purification systems relied on selenium filters. The raw materials for Zilithium synthesis were literally everywhere on Nexus Station. They were just bound up in forms that would poison a Keltorian faster than starvation. Jin leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with possibilities. The cleaning solvents were highly caustic, designed to strip away the toughest stains and corrosion. The titanium compounds were mixed with acids that would burn through organic tissue. The selenium was paired with heavy metals that would shut down a Keltorian's nervous system in minutes. But what if those toxic elements could be separated out? What if the useful components could be extracted and purified? Jin wasn't a chemist, but he'd grown up helping his father repair old machinery back on Earth. Sometimes the solution wasn't finding new parts. It was taking apart what you had and rebuilding it better. He started making lists, calculating quantities and costs. A single bottle of industrial cleaner cost 12 credits and contained enough manganese compounds to theoretically produce 3 doses of synthetic zilithium. The titanium oxide was even cheaper, considered waste material by the maintenance crews. For the first time in weeks, Jin felt genuine hope stirring in his chest. The other species might accept the death of the elderly Keltorians as natural selection. But humans had never been. Gojin's hands shook as he poured the industrial cleaner into a glass beaker. The medical bay's small laboratory felt cramped, with both him and Hana hunched over the workstation, but it was the only place on the station where they could work without attracting unwanted attention. "Are you sure about this?" Hana asked for the 10th time, adjusting the temperature controls on the separation unit. "One mistake and we could create something that kills him faster than starvation." "I'm not sure about anything," Jin admitted, watching the cleaner bubble and foam as it heated up. "But doing nothing definitely kills him, so we have to try." Their first attempt was a disaster. The manganese separated from the cleaning solution just fine, but when Jin tried to combine it with the titanium compounds, the mixture turned bright green and started smoking. The chemical analyzer on Hana's computer screen flashed warning signs about toxic gas production. "Well, that would definitely poison him," Hana said dryly, activating the ventilation system to clear the air. The second attempt looked more promising. Jin managed to extract pure selenium from the water filters and combine it with the manganese in the right proportions. But when they tested the mixture on a small sample of Keltorian tissue that Hana had obtained from the medical database, the tissue immediately began dissolving. "We're missing something," Jin muttered, studying his notes for the 100th time. "The ratios are right, but the molecular structure isn't stable." Night after night, they returned to the laboratory after their regular shifts. Jin would smuggle in raw materials from his supply runs, while Hana provided the medical equipment and expertise. Their quarters became cluttered with failed experiments and detailed chemical diagrams. By the 15th attempt, Jin was ready to give up. Every formula they tried either produced toxic sludge or unstable compounds that broke down within minutes. Vorth was getting weaker by the day, and Jin could see the hope fading from his ancient eyes each time another experiment failed. "Maybe the other species are right," Jin said, slumping in his chair after their latest failure had literally exploded in the beaker. "Maybe some problems can't be solved." Hana looked at him with surprise. In all the weeks they'd been working together, she'd never heard Jin sound defeated. "That doesn't sound like the stubborn human who found 47 dying aliens and decided to save them all." "I'm not saving anyone," Jin replied bitterly. "I'm just torturing an old man with false hope while he slowly dies." Hana was quiet for a moment, then pulled up a new set of chemical equations on her computer. What if we're thinking about this wrong? We've been trying to create pure zilithium, but maybe the Keltorian body doesn't need perfection. Maybe it just needs something close enough. That sparked a new idea in Jin's tired mind. Instead of trying to recreate the exact mineral compound from Keltorian homeworld, what if they created a synthetic substitute that performed the same function? Human. Medicine was full of artificial replacements for natural compounds. Their 16th attempt used a completely different approach. Instead of trying to perfectly match zilithium's molecular structure, Jin focused on creating something that would interact with Keltorian cells in the same way. He lowered the concentration of active ingredients and added stabilizing agents. That would make the compound gentler on organic tissue. The result was a pale blue liquid that looked nothing like natural zilithium, but showed promising signs in their tissue tests. When they fed it to the sample Keltorian cells, instead of dissolving or being rejected, the cells actually began showing signs of renewed activity. "Jin," Hana whispered, staring at the computer readout. "I think this might actually work." They brought the sample to Vorth in the maintenance tunnel, both of them nervous about what would happen. The old Keltorian was so weak he could barely lift his head, but when Jin explained what they'd created, something like hope flickered in his faded eyes. "If it doesn't work," Vorth whispered through the translator, "at least I will die knowing someone cared enough to try." Jin helped him drink the pale blue liquid, holding his breath as they waited for a reaction. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then gradually Vorth's breathing became easier, his posture straightened slightly. And then, like stars appearing at twilight, tiny flecks of blue began to shimmer across his grey shell. The change in Vorth was impossible to hide. Within 3 days of taking Jin's synthetic compound, the old Keltorian was walking through the maintenance tunnels under his own power. The blue patterns on his shell grew brighter each day, creating intricate designs that seemed to pulse with renewed life. Word traveled fast in the forgotten corners of Nexus Station. Keltorians who had been hiding in the deepest shadows began emerging, drawn by whispers of hope they'd thought was lost forever. They came slowly at first, cautious and afraid, but when they saw Vorth standing upright with his shell gleaming, their disbelief turned to desperate hope. "There are so many of them," Hana breathed as Jin led her through the tunnels to meet the growing group. What had started as scattered individuals hiding alone had become a gathering of nearly 60 elderly Keltorians, all looking at Jin with expressions of desperate faith. Jin felt overwhelmed by their expectations. His small batch of synthetic compound had been enough to help Vorth, but producing medication for 60 people would require equipment and resources he didn't have access to. That's when Minho found him. The station's chief engineer had heard rumors about the miraculous recovery of an elderly alien in the lower levels. Unlike most of the other species on Nexus Station, Minho was curious rather than dismissive. He'd worked alongside humans for years and had learned to respect their stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "I hear you've been playing chemist in the medical bay," Minho said, finding Jin during his lunch break. The Korean engineer was a few years older than Jin, with calloused hands and an easy smile that had made him popular among the station's human crew. Jin tensed, wondering if he was about to get in trouble. Unauthorized use of medical equipment was probably against station regulations. "I was just trying to help someone," he said carefully. "Relax," Minho laughed. "I'm not here to bust you. I'm here to offer help. Show me what you've been working on." That evening, Jin and Hana gave Minho a demonstration of their synthesis process. The engineer watched with growing interest as they broke down industrial chemicals and reconstituted them into life-saving medicine. "This is brilliant improvisation," Minho said, examining Jin's handwritten notes. "But your production method is incredibly inefficient. You're doing by hand what could be automated with the right equipment." Within a week, Minho had quietly redirected resources from a dozen different station projects. A unused storage room in the engineering section became their production facility. Industrial equipment that was scheduled for maintenance was instead repurposed for chemical synthesis. Raw materials that would have been recycled were diverted to their operation. The 3 humans worked in shifts, producing enough synthetic compound to treat all the elderly Keltorians they could find. But as the forgotten aliens began emerging, from hiding and showing signs of recovery, the reaction from other species was not what Jin had expected. The Volthari traders who had mocked Jin weeks earlier now watched the recovering Keltorians with obvious discomfort. These weren't supposed to be contributing members of society anymore. Their cultural beliefs said that weak beings should fade away quietly, not return to life stronger than before. "This is unnatural," one Volthari muttered to his companion as they passed a group of elderly Keltorians sharing stories in what had once been an abandoned corridor. The grey shells should accept their fate, not fight against the natural order. But their discomfort was nothing compared to the reaction from the younger Keltorians on the station. When word reached the upper levels that dozens of their supposedly dead elders were not only alive but recovering, many came down to see for themselves. The reunion scenes were heartbreaking. Young Keltorians who thought they'd never see their grandparents again found them weak but alive in the tunnels below. Families that had held funeral ceremonies for relatives whose shells had faded discovered that those same relatives had been slowly starving just floors beneath their feet. The trouble started when Administrator Vex Noth received complaints from several species representatives about the unnatural activities happening in the lower levels. The tall insect-like Thrakari official had run Nexus Station for over 2 decades, maintaining order through strict adherence to what he called cosmic balance. Jin was in the middle of mixing a fresh batch of synthetic compound when station security arrived at their makeshift laboratory. 6 armed guards in full riot gear surrounded the small production facility, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "By order of Station Administrator Vex Noth, this illegal operation is hereby shut down," announced the lead security officer, a burly Nexian whose crystalline face showed no emotion. "All equipment is to be confiscated and all personnel detained for questioning." "Illegal?" Jin stood up slowly, his hands raised to show he wasn't reaching for anything dangerous. "We're making medicine to help people who are dying. How is that illegal?" "For you are interfering with the natural order of species development," the security officer replied, reading from an official datapad. "The administrator has determined that your actions constitute biological interference in violation of Station Regulation 847B. Minho stepped forward, his engineer's badge clearly visible on his uniform. "I've read every regulation in the station manual. There's no law against providing medical assistance to dying beings." "There is now," the officer said coldly. "Effective immediately, any unauthorized medical intervention that prolongs the life of beings deemed biologically obsolete is prohibited." Jin felt his blood boil. Biologically obsolete? These are people, not broken machinery. Before the situation could escalate further, a new voice echoed through the storage room. "What exactly is going on here?" Everyone turned to see Vorth entering the facility, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked nearly 30 other elderly Keltorians, their shells now glowing with renewed vitality. More importantly, they were accompanied by several younger Keltorians, and even a few members of other species. "Vorth," Jin said in surprise, "what are you doing here?" The old Keltorian smiled, his shell patterns dancing with amusement. "Word travels fast when station security starts marching through the lower levels with weapons drawn. We thought you might need character witnesses." One of the younger Keltorians stepped forward, her shell blazing with the bright patterns of someone in her prime. "Officer, I am Kathara, Chief Archivist for the Keltorian Cultural Authority. The being you're arresting just reunited me with my grandfather, who I was told died 3 years ago." She gestured to an elderly male whose shell now showed the distinctive markings of a master storyteller. "Grandfather has spent the last 2 days sharing oral histories that we thought were lost forever. Stories and songs that preserve thousands of years of our people's heritage." Another voice joined the conversation. This one belonged to a Thrakari engineer, whose forearms gestured excitedly as he spoke. "The old ones know techniques we had forgotten, advanced metallurgy, complex mathematics, engineering solutions that haven't been used in decades. Their knowledge is invaluable." The security officer looked uncertain for the first time since entering the room. The administrator's orders were clear. This operation must be shut down. Perhaps, said a new voice from the doorway, the administrator should hear about the economic benefits before making his final decision. Jin turned to see Sue, a human communications specialist who worked in the station's data management center. She was small and quiet, the kind of person who usually avoided confrontation, but her eyes blazed with determination as she held up her data pad. "I've been documenting the results of Jin's work," Sue announced to the room. "In the past 2 weeks, the recovered Keltorians have contributed solutions to 7 major engineering problems, restored 3 pieces of broken equipment that the maintenance crews had given up on, and provided historical context that helped resolve a trade dispute between 2 feuding species." She turned her datapad toward the security officer, showing graphs and statistics. "The economic value of their contributions already exceeds the cost of their medical treatment by over 300%. From a purely financial standpoint, keeping these people alive is highly profitable for the station." Jin stared at Sue in amazement. While he'd been focused on the moral imperative of saving lives, she'd been quietly building an economic case that even the most cold-blooded administrator couldn't ignore. "Furthermore," Sue continued, "I've been in contact with administrators on 17 other stations throughout this sector. They're all dealing with similar populations of abandoned elderly from various species. The synthetic compound Jin developed could be worth millions of credits if properly distributed." The security officer's crystalline face remained expressionless, but Jin could see the gears turning behind his eyes. Cosmic balance was one thing, but profit was a language that every species in the galaxy understood. "I will relay this information to Administrator Vex Noth," the officer finally said. "All personnel will remain here until further orders are received." As the security team withdrew to await new instructions, Jin felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. They'd bought themselves time, but the real test was just beginning. 3 months after Administrator Vex Noth reluctantly approved Jin's operation, the effects had spread far beyond Nexus Station. Sue's quiet work in the communications center had turned into a full-scale information campaign, sending detailed instructions for synthesizing the compound to every major trading hub in 3 star systems. Jin stood in what had once been an abandoned storage room, now transformed into a proper medical facility. Through the reinforced windows, he could see elderly Keltorians walking freely through the station's main corridors for the first time in decades. Their glowing shell patterns created a beautiful light show that drew curious onlookers from dozens of different species. "The first shipment is ready for transport to Kepler Station," Minho announced, checking items off his datapad. The Korean engineer had become the unofficial logistics coordinator for their expanding operation, organizing supply chains and production schedules with military precision. Hana emerged from the laboratory section, wiping her hands on a clean towel. "I just got a message from the medical team on Titan Colony. They've successfully treated over 200 elderly Keltorians using our formula. The families are calling it a miracle." But the real miracle was happening much closer to home. Jin watched through the window as a young Keltorian female helped her elderly grandfather navigate the busy marketplace. The old male's shell blazed with complex patterns that told stories of ancient battles and forgotten wisdom. Shopkeepers who would have ignored him weeks ago now stopped to listen to his tales, recognizing the value of his knowledge. The change wasn't limited to the Keltorians. Other species had begun questioning their own treatment of the elderly, and the results were surprising everyone. "You need to see this," Sue said, rushing into the facility with her datapad clutched in her hands. Her usually calm demeanor was replaced by barely contained excitement. "The Thrakari High Command just issued a new military directive." Jin gathered around with the others as Sue displayed the official communication on the wall screen. The message was written in the harsh, angular script of the warrior species, but the translation was clear. "Effective immediately. All retired Thrakari warriors are to be recalled to active advisory positions," Sue read aloud. "Combat experience and tactical knowledge of veteran soldiers will be integrated into current military planning. Previous policies of warrior retirement are hereby suspended. They're bringing back their old soldiers," Minho said with amazement. "The same species that used to mock us for helping useless elderly are now admitting their veterans have value." The news got even better. A week later, reports started coming in from Zenthari space about a revolutionary change in their efficiency. Protocols. The logical, emotionless species had always prided themselves on making decisions based purely on mathematical calculations. "Listen to this," Hana said, reading from a scientific journal on her datapad. A Zenthari research team studied the decision-making patterns of their eldest citizens and discovered that beings with over 60 years of experience made more accurate long-term predictions than younger individuals, even when using the same data sets. Jin shook his head in wonder. So the species that considers emotion a weakness just proved that elder wisdom is mathematically superior to youthful logic. The ripple effects continued spreading. On distant mining colonies, elderly workers who had been forced into early retirement were being consulted about equipment failures and safety procedures. Diplomatic missions began, including senior advisors whose decades of experience helped navigate complex negotiations. Even the Volthari, who had been among the most vocal critics of Jin's work, quietly began changing their policies. Reports filtered back through trading networks about senior Volthari being recalled from exile to advise on commercial strategies and risk management. But perhaps the most significant change was happening within families themselves. Jin received daily messages from across the galaxy, young beings reconnecting with grandparents they thought were dead, children learning forgotten skills from elders who had been written off as obsolete. "We've created something bigger than medicine," Jin realized, looking at the latest reports from Sue's data collection efforts. "We've started a cultural revolution." The numbers were staggering. Thousands of elderly beings from dozens of species were being reintegrated into their communities. Industries were rediscovering lost knowledge. Families were healing from generations of unnecessary grief. And it had. All started with one human refusing to walk past a dying alien in a maintenance tunnel. "The best part," Sue said with a smile, "is that we're just getting started. I've got requests for the formula from 18 more star systems, and 3 different species want to fund research into similar treatments for their own elderly populations." Jin looked around at his small team of humans who had somehow changed the galaxy through sheer stubborn compassion. They hadn't set out to revolutionize interspecies relations or challenge fundamental cultural assumptions. They'd just refused to let people die when they could help. 8 months had passed since Jin first found Vorth dying in the maintenance tunnels, and Nexus Station had become a completely different place. The elderly Keltorian now sat in the station's main diplomatic center, his shell blazing with intricate patterns that commanded respect from beings across the galaxy. His desk was positioned near the central hub, where trade negotiations took place daily, and there was rarely a moment when someone wasn't seeking his advice. "The Rigelian delegation is using formal contract language from the old trading protocols," Vorth explained to a frustrated Nexian merchant who had been struggling with translation issues for weeks. "In their culture, switching to ancient speech patterns means they're testing your commitment to long-term partnership, not trying to confuse you." Jin watched from across the busy center as the Nexian's crystalline face brightened with understanding. Within minutes, the two species were shaking hands, or the equivalent, over a deal that had seemed impossible just hours before. It was the 7th trade dispute Vorth had helped resolve that week. "He speaks 17 different languages fluently," Hana told Jin as they observed the scene, "and he understands the cultural nuances behind 30 more. The station's diplomatic efficiency has improved by over 40% since he started working here." Jin felt a warm sense of pride watching his friend thrive in his new role. Vorth had gone from a forgotten relic waiting to die to one of the most valuable advisors on the station. His centuries of experience with different species and their customs made him invaluable in the complex world of interstellar commerce. "The transport ship New Horizon is now boarding passengers for the Tau Ceti system," announced the station's automated voice system. Jin's stomach tightened as he heard the call. His new assignment awaited him on a mining station in the outer rim, where reports suggested similar problems with abandoned elderly from multiple species. "You're really leaving?" Minho asked, joining Jin and Hana near the observation deck. The Korean engineer had dark circles under his eyes. From managing 3 different production facilities, that now supplied synthetic compounds throughout the sector. "The work here is done," Jin replied, though his voice carried a hint of sadness. "You've got everything running smoothly, and Sue's documentation means any station can set up their own production facility. They don't need me anymore." That wasn't entirely true, and everyone knew it. Jin had become something of a legend throughout human space, the supply runner who had revolutionized elder care across dozens of species. But he'd never been comfortable with fame, preferring to focus on practical problems that needed solving. "Before you go," Sue said, appearing with her ever-present data pad, "I wanted to show you the latest sector-wide statistics." The numbers were remarkable. Over 12,000 elderly beings from 43 different species were now receiving treatment based on Jin's original formula. Mixed-species elder care facilities had opened on 27 stations and colonies. Most importantly, the cultural shift toward valuing elder wisdom was spreading to species that hadn't even been directly affected by the medical treatments. "Look at this," Sue continued, switching to a video feed from a space station 3 systems away. The image showed a bustling community center where elderly beings from 6 different species worked together, sharing knowledge and teaching younger generations skills that had nearly been lost forever. The Zenthari have established 43 wisdom centers where their eldest citizens advise on everything from engineering projects to philosophical questions, Sue explained. The Thrakari have created veteran advisory councils that have prevented 2 separate colonial conflicts through diplomatic intervention. Jin watched the video feed in amazement. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one dying alien had grown into a galactic movement. The sight of different species working together, with elderly beings treated as valuable contributors rather than burdens, represented everything he'd hoped to achieve. "There's something else," Hana added quietly. "We've been getting reports from the Outer Rim about abandoned elderly from species we've never even encountered. Word is spreading beyond our usual trade routes. The New Horizon final boarding call for Tau Ceti system," the station announcement repeated. Jin took one last look around the diplomatic center where Vorth was now mediating a complex negotiation between 3 different species. The old Keltorian caught his eye and raised one hand in a gesture of gratitude and farewell. As Jin walked toward the docking bay, he passed the new integrated elder care facility that had been built in what used to be abandoned storage space. Through the transparent walls, he could see elderly beings from dozens of species sharing meals, telling stories, and contributing their knowledge to solve problems that had puzzled younger generations. The galaxy was still far from perfect, but it was a little more compassionate than it had been 8 months ago. And sometimes Jin thought as he boarded the transport ship that was enough to change everything. Some of the younger Keltorians embraced their elders with joy and shame. Others struggled with guilt over how easily they'd accepted the cultural norm of abandonment. A few even questioned whether their society had been making a terrible mistake for generations. The emotional upheaval wasn't limited to the Keltorians. Other species began whispering among themselves, asking uncomfortable questions about their own treatment of the elderly and weak. Od at accepting the inevitable.